Imagine praying to God for virtue, for purity, for a better life, but adding a condition. Imagine saying, "Lord, make me good." But not just yet. This wasn't the prayer of a cynical atheist or a defiant rebel. This was the desperate, brutally honest plea of a man who would one day become one of the most influential saints in history, Augustine of Hippo. What was this one sin, this one part of his life so powerful, so deeply ingrained, that he literally asked God to wait before taking it away? The answer reveals more than just a personal struggle. It exposes a fundamental conflict within the human heart, a battle between the spirit and the flesh that defined a man and shaped the future of Western thought. Before the saint, there was the son. Born in 354 AD in the Roman province of Numidia, Aurelius Augustinus was a gifted child. His father, a pagan official named Patricius, saw his son's sharp mind as a ticket to worldly success. His mother, Monica, a devout Christian, saw it as a tool for God, if only she could steer him in the right direction. From a young age, Augustine's ambition burned as brightly as the African sun. He was sent to the best schools, mastering rhetoric, the art of persuasive speaking, which in the Roman Empire was the fast track to a career in law and politics. He was brilliant, he was restless, and he was hungry for everything life had to offer: knowledge, recognition, and pleasure. And the place to find all three was the sprawling, chaotic, and intoxicating city of Carthage. If you're finding this glimpse into a different time compelling, consider subscribing. We go deep into the stories that shaped our world. Carthage was the New York or London of its day, a crucible of cultures, ideas, and temptations. For a provincial boy like Augustine, it was a revelation. He wrote later, "To Carthage I came, where there sang all around me in my ears a cauldron of unholy loves." He threw himself into the student life with abandon. The theaters, with their dramatic and often licentious plays, captivated him. He fell in with a group of friends he called the Wreckers, known for their intellectual arrogance and disruptive behavior. But it was here, amidst the noise and the ambition, that the central struggle of his young life began to take shape. He wasn't just looking for cheap thrills. He was looking for love, for stability, for a connection. And he found it, not in a respectable marriage, but in a relationship that would define the next 15 years of his life. He entered into a relationship with a woman whose name he never tells us in his famous autobiography, The Times Confessions, **. She was his concubine, a socially accepted but legally unofficial union at the time. This wasn't a fleeting affair. This was a deep, monogamous, and loving partnership. She was his home. Together, they had a son, Adeodatus, a name meaning gift of God. Augustine loved him dearly. For over a decade, this woman was his faithful companion. So when we talk about Augustine's secret sin, it's crucial to understand this complexity. This wasn't a story of wild promiscuity. It was a story of a man in a committed, loving relationship that fell outside the bounds of what his later Christian faith would deem acceptable. He was bound to her by love, habit, and the son they shared. This bond was the chain he both cherished and, in his spiritual turmoil, longed to break. But Augustine's conflict wasn't just physical. It was intellectual. He was tormented by the problem of evil. If God is all good, where does evil come from? Mainstream Christianity's answers didn't satisfy his razor-sharp intellect. Then he discovered Manichaeism. It was a popular, quasi-Christian Gnostic religion that offered a simple, compelling solution. It taught that the universe was a battlefield between two co-eternal powers, a perfect, spiritual world of light and a corrupt, material world of darkness. Humans were sparks of this divine light trapped in the prison of a dark, material body. This idea was a huge relief for Augustine. It meant his struggles with lust weren't his fault. It was just the dark part of him acting out. His true self, the spark of light, was pure and blameless. For 9 years, this philosophy gave him an intellectual framework for his divided life. It allowed him to be a philosopher by day and indulge his passions by night, all without taking full responsibility. But Augustine's mind was too rigorous to be satisfied for long. He began to see inconsistencies in Manichaean teachings, especially their bizarre and unscientific astronomical theories. He kept asking questions that his local teachers couldn't answer. They all told him to wait. Just wait until the great Manichaean bishop, Faustus, comes to town. Faustus, they promised, was a man of immense learning and eloquence who would resolve all his doubts. Augustine waited with bated breath. This meeting, he believed, would be the moment of ultimate clarification. When Faustus finally arrived, Augustine was deeply disappointed. He found a man who was charming and well-spoken, but who was, in Augustine's own words, profoundly ignorant of the liberal arts and sciences. He could repeat the Manichaean talking points beautifully, but when pressed on the substance, he had nothing. The entire intellectual edifice crumbled for Augustine. He realized he had wasted 9 years of his life on a system that was philosophically and scientifically hollow. Disillusioned and restless, Augustine decided his ambition needed a bigger stage. He left Africa for Rome, the heart of the empire, taking his partner and their son with him. He hoped to establish a more prestigious school of rhetoric, but he found the students in Rome to be cynical and dishonest, often skipping out before paying their fees. His career stalled. Then, an opportunity arose. A position opened up for the professor of rhetoric for the imperial court in Milan. It was a job of immense prestige and influence. Using his connections, he secured the post. In 384 AD, at the age of 30, Augustine arrived in Milan. He was now at the center of power, a public figure, a success. But spiritually, he was completely adrift. His Manichaean faith was shattered, but he still found the Christianity of his mother intellectually crude. It was in Milan, however, that he would meet a man who would change everything. Part of Augustine's official duties was to deliver speeches on behalf of the emperor. To do this well, he needed to study the speaking style of Milan's most famous orator, the city's Catholic bishop, Ambrose. Augustine started attending Ambrose's sermons not for their spiritual content, but as a professional rhetorician studying a master's technique. He was immediately struck by Ambrose's eloquence. But then, he started listening to the words themselves. Ambrose was a formidable intellectual, a man who could blend classical philosophy with a sophisticated, allegorical interpretation of the scriptures. He presented Christianity in a way Augustine had never encountered before, as a faith that was intellectually robust, philosophically deep, and fully compatible with reason. For the first time, Augustine saw that one could be both a brilliant intellectual and a faithful Christian. The door to his mother's faith, which he had long considered closed, began to creak open. We cannot tell this story without understanding the relentless force of his mother, Monica. She had followed him from Africa to Milan, never once giving up hope for his conversion. For years, she had prayed and wept for her son. There's a famous story where, in her distress, she went to a bishop who, exasperated but compassionate, told her, "Go on your way, and God bless you, for it is impossible that the son of these tears should perish." Her faith was not a simple, unthinking piety. It was a powerful, persistent love that acted as a constant pressure on Augustine's conscience. In Milan, he was surrounded by the intellectual arguments of Ambrose on one side, and the unwavering, tearful prayers of his mother on the other. He was intellectually cornered. He was beginning to believe. But one enormous obstacle remained: his life, his partner, his 15-year habit of the flesh. As Augustine moved closer to Christianity, the pressure to conform his life to its teachings mounted. For a man of his social standing and ambition, a respectable marriage was essential. His mother, ever the pragmatist, arranged a match for him with a wealthy young heiress. It was a perfect strategic move for his career. But there was a brutal condition. To marry this girl, he had to send away the woman he had lived with for 15 years, the mother of his son. The sin that had to be surrendered was not an abstract lust. It was a living, breathing person. He describes the moment of her departure in the Times, Confessions Times, with gut-wrenching honesty. "My heart, which clung to her, was broken and wounded and bleeding. She returned to Africa, vowing never to be with another man." Augustine, in his ambition and his tortured search for God, had to sever the most significant human bond he had ever known. The separation shattered him. And to make matters worse, his intended bride was 2 years too young for marriage. He had to wait. Augustine, now intellectually convinced of the truth of Christianity, but emotionally devastated and unable to endure celibacy, did something that reveals the depth of his struggle. He took another, temporary mistress. This is the core of his crisis. He knew what he should do, but he could not bring himself to do it. He was a man with a divided will. He famously wrote, "I was held fast, not by a physical chain, but by the chain of my own will." He wanted to be free, but he also loved his chains. This is the context for that famous prayer, "Grant me chastity and continence, but not yet." It was the cry of a man who saw the shore but felt himself being pulled back by the undertow of his own desires and habits. He was stuck, paralyzed by his own internal civil war. The breaking point came one afternoon in a garden in Milan. He was with his close friend Alypius, discussing his spiritual paralysis. A visitor had just told them the story of 2 Roman officials who, upon reading the life of Saint Anthony of the Desert, had instantly renounced their worldly careers to serve God. The story hit Augustine like a physical blow. These uneducated men could make a choice that he, the great intellectual, could not. Overwhelmed with shame and self-loathing, he fled into the garden and collapsed under a fig tree, weeping violently. He cried out to God, "How long, Lord? How long? Tomorrow and tomorrow? Why not now? Why not this very hour, an end to my uncleanness?" He was in a state of complete emotional and spiritual collapse. He had reached the absolute end of his own strength. And it was there, in that moment of total surrender, that he heard it. From a nearby house, he heard what sounded like a child's voice, chanting in a sing-song manner, "Tolly, ledger. Tolly, ledge. Take up and read. Take up and read." At first, he wondered if it was part of some children's game he didn't know. But then, a thought struck him. He remembered the story of Saint Anthony, who had been converted by hearing a passage of the Gospel read in church. He interpreted the child's voice as a divine command. He rushed back to where Alypius was sitting, where he had left a copy of the letters of St. Paul. He snatched up the book, opened it at random, and his eyes fell on a passage from the Epistle to the Romans. Chapter 13. Not in rioting and drunkenness, not in chambering and wantonness, not in strife and envying, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ, and make no provision for the flesh, to gratify its desires. He needed to read no further. As he finished the sentence, he wrote, "A light of serenity was infused into my heart, and all the darkness of doubt vanished away." In that instant, the war was over. The desire that had tormented him for decades was simply gone. The craving, the habit, the internal division, it all ceased. It wasn't an act of his own willpower. He had already tried that and failed for years. He described it as a moment of pure grace, a gift he could not earn but only receive in a moment of complete surrender. He calmly told Alypius what had happened. His friend, inspired, took the book and read the very next line, which spoke of welcoming the weak in faith. The two friends, their long search finally over, went inside to tell Augustine's mother the news. Monica, the woman whose tears had watered the ground for this moment, was overcome with a quiet, profound joy. Her prayers had been answered beyond her wildest dreams. At the Easter Vigil in 387 AD, Augustine, his son Adeodatus, and Alypius were baptized by Bishop Ambrose in Milan. This was the definitive turning point. He immediately resigned his prestigious post as professor of rhetoric. The worldly ambition that had driven him his entire life was extinguished, replaced by a new purpose. He decided to return to his hometown in North Africa to live a quiet life of prayer and philosophical contemplation with a small community of friends. The old Augustine, the careerist, the social climber, the man enslaved by his desires, was gone. In his place was a man who had been broken down and remade by an encounter with what he could only describe as divine grace. Tragically, both his mother Monica and his son Adeodatus would die shortly after, but Augustine's new path was set. Augustine's quiet life didn't last long. He was soon persuaded, and then practically forced, by the people to become a priest, and eventually the Bishop of Hippo. For the next 30 years, he would become one of the most prolific and influential thinkers in history. And his theology was profoundly shaped by that decade-long war with himself. His intense experience of a divided will led to his doctrine of original sin, the idea that humanity is born with a propensity to sin that we cannot overcome on our own. His dramatic, unearned moment of release in the garden became the foundation for his powerful doctrine of divine grace, the belief that salvation is not something we achieve, but a free gift from God. He understood human weakness so intimately because he had lived it so deeply. He could write about the battle between the spirit and the flesh, not as a theoretical problem, but as the lived reality of his own story. Augustine's story endures not because he was a perfect saint, but because he was so imperfectly human. His prayer, "Make me chaste, but not yet," resonates because we all have a not yet in our lives. That thing we know we should change, that habit we should break, that step we should take, but not yet. His journey reminds us that transformation is often not a clean, heroic act of will, but a messy, painful, and prolonged process of surrender. It's a story of how the greatest strengths can be forged in the fire of our most profound weaknesses. What is the not yet you've bargained with in your own life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. It's a conversation worth having.